The morning of the auction, there were 44 alpacas nobody wanted. They stood crowded into the low-back pen at Dupree's Switch, out past the good stock and the clean rails, where the real money changed hands, and the last golden hour of a Worcester County day came down over the whole dusty yard the way it always did, thick and slow and forgiving of nearly everything except what was in that pen. There was no forgiving that. They were culls out of an operation 2 counties over that had folded up in the spring, the leftovers of the leavings, hauled here in a stock trailer to be got rid of at whatever a body would pay. And they looked it. Their fleece had gone to felt on them, matted into hard gray dreadlocks, clotted with burrs and dung and the memory of rain, so that a man could not have told you where one animal stopped and the next began. Under the mats the frames were wrong, ribs standing up like the poles of a leaning tent, hip bones sharp as fence corners, long necks held at a tired droop. They hummed. That was the thing that turned a stranger's stomach without his quite knowing why. A low, thin, wrong hum that went through the pen and did not stop, 44 sick throats making the same small complaint at once, a sound with no bottom to it. Doss ran the pens at Dupree's Switch, and had run them for 30 years, and he was a wiry, weathered man in a wide-brim hat who did not waste breath, and when the runt lot came up he named it flat, the breed, the head count, the condition. No dressing on it, and then he did the one honest thing a good auctioneer can do for a lot that will not carry, which is to say nothing, and let the silence answer. The silence answered. Men leaned on the good rails and looked at the pen the way you look at a wreck on the shoulder. Half pity and half gladness it is not yours, and a few of them laughed the low, easy laugh that costs a man nothing. And the number Doss called into that laughter went nowhere and came back to him unclaimed. That was when Vada Sturgill came down the line. She came past the good pens and the fat, clean stock and the leaning, laughing men as though she could not hear them, which was not the same as pretending, and anyone watching close would have seen it was not the same. She simply had her mind set somewhere the laughter could not reach. She was a lean, wiry young woman, narrow through the shoulders, in a faded chambray shirt with the sleeves turned to the forearm, and a sweat-stained ball cap pulled low over a chestnut ponytail, and her boots and her hands and the knees of her jeans carried the honest dirt of a person who had worked that morning and would work again that night. She did not go to the rail like a buyer. She went to it like a woman going to a bedside. She crouched down on her heels at the pen, easy and grounded, elbows on her knees, and she looked at the 44 for a long time without saying anything at all. She was not counting money in her head. She was reading them, and she was reading them her grandfather's way, though not one soul in that yard would have known it to watch her, looking past the felt and the ribs to the set of them, to which ones carried their weight low and steady, and which of them, even here, even starved, kept their eyes lifted to the far ridge instead of down at their own misery. Her grandfather had a line for it. "Find the heaviest ones with their eyes to the ridge," he used to say, though the man had been dead some years now and said nothing to anybody. There were such ones in that pen. And there was one in particular, a matted female bigger through the chest than the rest, who did a thing the others did not do. When Vada's shadow came across the rail, the animal shifted herself around and planted her body square between the young woman and the huddle behind her, and stood there, and looked at Vada, and did not look away. It was not a friendly thing, it was a guarding thing. Vada put her open hand flat through the rails and held it still, palm up, asking nothing, and after a long moment the big female stretched her ragged neck out and set her muzzle down against it, and let it stay. Vada bought the whole lot. She bought it cheap because there was no one to run the price against her, and she paid for it in cash, counting the bills out flat and slow into Ferendos's palm while the yard watched her do it. One and then another. No card and no note and no bank behind it. Money that had plainly been saved and not borrowed. And Doss took it and folded it and gave her the ticket and said only, "They're yours," which under the circumstances was as close to a kindness as the trade allowed. Now, a thing like that does not go by in a sale yard without a voice put to it, and the voice belonged to Burnell Chumley. Chumley was the big cattleman holding court by the good pens, broad through the chest and belly, ruddy and gray stubbled, a clean seed company cap on his head, and expensive boots on his feet, and both thumbs hooked in his belt loops, like a man who had never once in his life doubted he was right. He could not let it pass in silence. Men like Chumley almost never can, and he said it for the crowd, pitched to carry, so the laughing men would have their laugh handed to them ready-made. "Well, boys," he said, "there she goes. Just bought herself 44 head of walking mops. He let that land, and took the first chuckle, and spent it, and reached for more. That ain't a herd, honey, that's coyote bait. You just paid good cash money for a pen full of coyote bait, and the coyotes are going to thank you for it come winter." And he got his laugh, the big easy one, the whole rail of them giving it up to him. And he stood there in it, pleased as a hog in shade. Vada did not turn around. She took her ticket and went to bring the trailer up. And here is the thing the narrator will ask you to hold on to, because the whole story turns on it. Burnell Chumley had meant those words as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. If this is the kind of story you stay for, the kind where a woman like Vada gets written off by a whole county and just keeps working, do me a small favor. Tap the like button and, in the comments, tell me the town or city you're watching from, because I read every single one. Now, let's begin, because you would be wrong if you were sitting where Chumley sat that evening, to think that Vada Sturgill had come down to Dupree Switch with a plan. She had not come home because she had a plan. She had come home the way a river comes back to a channel it forgot it ever knew, not choosing it so much as running downhill until the old shape caught her. The truth of it was plainer and smaller than any plan. Her great-aunt Dosie was failing. Dosie Sturgill was 80-some and living alone up on the old Sturgill Hill place that had been Vada's grandfather Farrell's before he died, and word had come down through the thin family telegraph that the old woman was getting the wood in wrong and forgetting the stove, and somebody had to go up and see to her before another winter took its swing, and there was no one else. That was the whole of it on one side. On the other side was Vada's own life, which had come apart so quietly that she could not have told you the day it happened. A job that folded under her when the place she worked simply closed its doors. A lease that was not renewed. A town that had gone on being a town without seeming to need her in it. She had packed what fit and driven out, and what met her at the top of the lane was not opportunity. It was obligation, wearing the clothes of home. She hauled the 44 up that lane in the last of the light, the trailer moaning behind the old truck, and the place came at her out of the golden dust, one worn-out thing at a time. The leaning gray barn with the daylight showing between its boards, the dead ochre pasture cracked open in the low places, the hand-cut stone trough her great-grandfather had set by hand, and that had held water. For 100 years, and up by the shed, the vintage Ford pickup Farrell had driven, sunk to its rims in weeds now, rusted and slack-tired, and quietly composing its own obituary. Dosie was on the porch, She was a small, narrow, patient old woman, the same wiry bone Vada had, white hair loosely pinned, in faded men's coveralls with rubber barn boots on her feet. And she had a pan in her lap and was shelling peas into it with hands that had never in 80 years learned how to be still. She watched the trailer come up and stop. She watched her great niece climb down and open the gate and let the 44 out into the near lot, and she watched them come out humming and matted and staggering thin into the good light, and she did not say what nearly anyone else alive would have said. Vada came up to the porch and stood at the bottom step and told her the whole foolish story plainly. The way you tell an elder a thing when you have already done it and are not asking permission, only laying it down where they can see it, the folded operation, the back pen, the laughing men, the cash, the coyote bait. Dosey let a long prairie silence go by. She shelled 2 more peas into the pan. Then she looked out at the ragged crowd of them in the dying light, and she said only, "Those are the ones." That was all. She did not explain it, and Vada did not ask her to, because there are sentences an old woman hands you like a stone she has carried a long way, and you do not chip at them, you put them in your pocket and go on. The next day, hunting through the deep drawer of the kitchen sideboard for a candle stub, Vada found the ledger. She knew it the second her hand touched it, though she had not seen it in 15 years, a cloth-bound book, the cloth gone the green of old moss, swelled and soft at the corners from decades of a man's thumb. It was Farrell's. She sat down on the kitchen floor in the slant of the window, with it open across her knees, and turned the pages, and the whole of her grandfather's working life came up off them in his small, hard pencil hand, columns of weather going back before she was born, the first frost and the last, the inches of rain and the weeks with none, herd tallies, births and deaths and cullings, and, folded into the back and the margins, his own hand-drawn maps of the hill, the pastures numbered, arrows for the rotation, which ground to graze, in which month, and which to rest. It was not a diary. There was almost nothing in it about himself. It was a record of paying attention, kept for so long and so faithfully that the attention had become a kind of knowledge, and the knowledge a kind of instruction meant for whoever came after and had the patience to read it. Near the front, on a page by itself, one line was underlined so hard the pencil had near gone through the paper, gone over twice, the way a man marks the one thing he most needs the future to hear. The stock that stands guard outlives the stock that only fattens. Vada read it 3 times. Beside it, tucked into the gutter of the book, was a photograph gone amber with age, a young man in a field. Her grandfather, though it took her a breath to be sure, because she had only ever known him old, and around him, long-necked and calm and clear-eyed, stood the same old line alpacas she had hauled up the lane the night before. The same breed, the same watchful set to them, whole and healthy, and looking off at something past the edge of the picture. She sat with that a long time. Then she took her grandmother's advice and her grandfather's line and her 44 coyote bait, and she started. And a day or 2 on, in the gray of an early morning while she was out among them, she looked up, and there was a boy at the bottom of the lane. He was a teenage farmhand from the Mabry place down the road, a serious, quiet, watchful boy in a plain flannel and a ball cap. And everyone in that end of the county knew the Mabry place was a hard place to be a child. His name was Lyndon Mabry. He did not come up, and he did not say anything, and he did not ask for anything. He just stood at the foot of the lane in the cold, with his hands in his pockets, and watched the strange, unaccountable sight of a young woman out in the dead pasture on her heels, among 44 animals the whole county had already buried, watched her the way you watch a thing you do not have words for yet, but know, somehow, that you are going to want to be near. He watched a while, and then he went on. But the narrator will tell you now, as a fact offered for consideration, that he came back the next morning, and the one after that. His name was Lyndon Mabry, though it would be some days before Vada Sturgill learned it, because he did not offer it and she did not ask. And there is a kind of country understanding in which a boy is allowed to stand at the foot of a lane for as long as he needs to, before anyone requires anything of him at all. He came from the Mabry place down along the bottom road, which was a house people spoke of in the low voice reserved for troubles that are not any of your business, but are none the less known to everyone, and he had the look of a child who had learned early to make himself small and useful in rooms where being neither could go badly. He watched her work the herd for 3 gray mornings from that spot at the road, and on the 4th he did not stop at the road. He came up the frozen ruts of the lane, with his hands still jammed in his pockets and his cap pulled low, and he stood at the pasture fence instead, close enough now to see the steam rising off the animals' backs, and Vada let him stand there too, because she understood the difference between a boy who wanted something from you and a boy who only wanted to be near a thing that made sense. And she had been the second kind herself once, and she had not forgotten it. She had gone back to the ledger by then the way another woman might have gone back to a church. She had laid it open on the kitchen table under the window, and she had studied her grandfather Farrell Sturgill's hand-drawn rotation maps the way you study the face of someone you are trying to remember. And she had walked the dead hill with the pages in her mind until she could see the old lines on it that were no longer marked by anything but the memory of a man who had died before she was grown. He had divided the hill into wedges, the way you would cut a pie, and he had moved the stock through the wedges in a turning that let the ground rest and come back and rest again. And he had fed them scant, always scant, because the old line alpacas were foraging animals bred down from a hardness that a softer age had forgotten, and a full trough made them fat and slow and stupid, and a lean range made them what they were meant to be. So Vada ranged them. She turned them out onto the tired ochre pasture and let them work it, and she fed them thin against every instinct the modern world had tried to teach her, and she watched, and she waited, and she wrote it all down. And the hill answered her the way ground answers patience, which is to say slowly, and then all at once. The matting came off them first in the low places, where the felted greasy locks that had grown over years of neglect finally lifted and parted and gave way to the clean deep staple growing up underneath, so that within 2 months an animal that had come off the trailer, looking like a walking heap of ruined carpet, stood in the pasture, wearing a fleece that caught the winter light, and held it, their bony hips filled. The knife edge along their spines softened and rounded, and became muscle, and the muscle became a kind of alertness, a standing weight, and they carried their long necks higher and turned their heads to the ridgeline in a way that had nothing of fear in it and everything of watch. They were becoming what they had been under all that ruin the whole time. They were becoming, though Vada did not yet have the word for it, and would not have used the word if she had, guardians. Word of the scant feed reached the feed store at Dupree Switch, the way all word reached it, carried on the mouths of men who had nothing better to carry, and Burnell Chumley took it up gladly, because a man who has made a public prediction of failure will tend the fire of that prediction against all weather. He stood among the sacks and the salt blocks, with his thumbs in his belt loops and his seed company cap clean on his head, and he told the men what the Sturgill girl was doing up on that hill, half-starving 44 head of coyote bait on a dead pasture, feeding them like she was punishing them. And he laughed the easy laugh that a crowd will always help a prosperous man to laugh. And he told them she would lose the whole lot by Christmas. To the cold, if the cold got there first. To the coyotes, if it did not. He said it, the way you say a thing you have decided is already true, and the men agreed with him the way men agree with the one among them who owns the most cattle. And it was, the narrator will tell you, a comfortable and well-attended little certainty. And it was wrong in every particular, and not one of the men laughing in that store would live to be asked to remember that he had laughed. On the hill, meanwhile, the boy Lyndon had come through the fence. It happened on a gray morning with a mean wind out of the north, the kind of morning that finds the gaps in a coat, and Vada came out from the barn carrying the water and found the boy already there, and before she could reach him he had crossed to where the bucket stood and taken one up in both hands and started for the trough. He did not ask. He did not look at her for permission or for praise. He simply saw the work that needed doing and put his hands to it. And Vada stood in the barn door and watched him carry the water to the animals, watched how the herd did not spook from him the way they spooked from most, watched how he moved slow and low and easy among them without ever seeming to decide to, and she felt something turn over quietly in her chest. Because there is a thing in some people's hands that cannot be put there by teaching and cannot be taken out by hardship, a thing the animals read long before any person does, and Vada had it, and her grandfather had it, and Doki had it in her old shelling fingers, and she saw now, watching a troubled boy from a troubled house carry water he had not been asked to carry, that he had it too. You could teach a person a great many things. You could not teach them that. You could only recognize it when it walked up your lane, and she recognized it, and she said nothing, and she let him stay, and he stayed. It was into this, the filling herd, the clean staple, the silent boy who came every day now, that Denver Skidmore came up the lane on a still cold afternoon in the low golden end of the year. He was a thin, stooped man in his 70s, with a lifetime of shearing folded into the curve of his back and a pencil tucked behind one ear, and he had heard the same store talk as everyone. But he had heard something else in it that the laughing men had not, because he was a fiber man, and a fiber man's ear is tuned to a different frequency than a cattleman's. He came without announcing himself, and he found Vada in the barn with a fleece across the table, and he did not say much of anything by way of greeting. He crossed to the table, and he put his old calloused hands into the fleece the way another man might put his hands into water on a hot day, and he worked it between his fingers, and he lifted a staple and drew it out to its length, and let it spring back, and he pressed his thumb into the crimp of it, and watched how it recovered. And he did all this slowly and with a complete and craftsman's absorption, the way one worker will handle the finished work of another worker he has never met, and take, in the handling, the full measure of the man. For a while he said nothing at all. Then he said, "This is not bad fiber." He said it flat and quiet, and Vada understood, because she had grown up among people who spoke like this, that from a man like Denver Skidmore this was very nearly the highest praise the language contained. His eye went then to the ledger, which lay open on the end of the table where Vada had left it, and he looked at the weather columns and the herd tallies and the careful maps in Farrell Sturgill's dead hand, and something moved through his weathered face that was older than the afternoon. "Your grandfather knew his ground," he said. And then, still looking at the herd through the barn door, at the long necks turned to the ridge, he said the other thing, the flat thing, The same three-word sentence that Doki had let fall on the porch that first evening after the whole foolish story had been told. "These are the ones," he said. And Veta felt the words settle over the words the old woman had spoken. Two old people 2 miles and a generation apart saying the identical thing about the same animals in the same flat voice of country certainty. And she did not answer, because there was nothing to add to a thing that had now been said twice by people who knew. That night she took a plain notebook down off the shelf, green cloth like her grandfather's had been green cloth, because some inheritances are carried in the choosing of small things, and she began to write her own method into it beneath his. She wrote the rotation as she was running it, and the weather as it came, and the count of the herd, and near the top of the first page she wrote, in her own hand, and underlined it hard the way he had underlined his line, "Keep the ones with their eyes to the ridge line." And here the narrator must tell you a small true thing about Vada Sturgill, because it is the whole of her. She did not name them. She had held to that from the sale barn on. You do not name what you may have to sell or bury. You do not make a person out of a head of stock, and she had kept that fence up in herself against 44 soft-eyed reasons to let it down. She did not name them. She held that line. She almost held that line, because there was one among them, a bold, matted female, who had planted herself between Vada and the rest that first day at the pen rail, and who now stood always at the highest point of the pasture, with her eyes fixed on the ridge, like a thing carved to face north. And one evening Vada found the name already in her mouth before she had decided to have it there, and she let it out. Quiet, just the once, into the cold. Sentinel, and having said it she could not unsay it, and did not try. The first fleece she sold went to a hand spinner over in the next township, a woman who worked at a wheel by her own kitchen window and who ran the clean, deep staple through her fingers and paid without haggling and asked when there would be more. It was not much money. It was enough to buy grain and mend a stretch of the good fence and put a little by, and more than the money it was the first outside voice that was not laughing, the first hand that had reached out from off the hill and closed around the thing Vada was making and pronounced it good, and word of it began to travel the way that kind of word travels in a county, quietly, kitchen to kitchen. Under the louder word the men were still passing around at the store. Two kinds of talk about the same hill, moving through the same winter, and only one of them true, and it was not yet the loud one. Then the weather turned, and it turned the way the worst things turn, which is to say it arrived first as itself, and only later as ruin. The winter came down early, and it came down hard and clean and cold, weeks ahead of its season, a deep, still-killing cold that locked the ground iron and stopped the creeks and pressed down on the whole county like a hand. And out of the high ridges, driven down off their own frozen ground by the same early hunger, came the coyotes, not the ordinary 2 or 3 that any winter brings, but a plague of them, an eruption, pack on pack, pushed down out of the hills into the low country where the stock was, and the nights filled up with them. Worcester County had spent a generation building itself tidy. It had put its lambs and its calves and its kid goats and its poultry behind clean, straight woven wire, in trim pens close to trim barns, confident in the modern way that a good fence and a bright yard light were answer enough to anything with teeth. And the modern way failed. It failed night after night up and down the county, because a straight fence around a huddled, confined animal is not protection from a pack. It is a plate. It holds the stock still and gathers it in one place for the taking, and the coyotes went down the tidy operations one after another and emptied them. Men woke to blood on the trodden snow and gaps in the count, and a silence where there had been stock. And they woke to it again the next morning, and the next, and there was in the whole cold county a rising helpless dread, because nothing they knew how to do was working. Up on the Sturgill Hill the pack came too. It came over the ridge on a night of hard stars, and Vada woke to the sound of it, to a sound she had never heard the herd make and would never forget, because her mocked animals did not do what stock does. They did not huddle, and they did not run, and they did not stand frozen to be taken. They massed. Out of some deep old wiring that the softer breeds had lost, and the folded operation 2 counties over had nearly starved out of these, but had not, the whole herd drew together, and turned outward, and threw up into the black cold a high-wrong screaming alarm, a sound to raise the hair on a person's neck, and they moved as one body toward the threat instead of away from it. And at the fence line, out ahead of all of them, planted square between the pack and the herd, with her long neck low, and her whole weight forward, stood Sentinel. Vada came out onto the frozen yard with her heart going, and she did not fire a shot, and she did not need to, because by the time she reached the fence, the coyotes were already breaking, already sliding back up the slope and over the ridge and gone, driven off the hill by 44 animals a whole county had called walking mops, and not one thing on her ground had been touched. Not one. Come morning, the snow inside her fences was clean of blood, and the herd stood steaming and whole in the risen light, with their eyes already gone back to the ridge, watching the way they always watched. She took in others after that. Word had begun to move, faster now than the pack itself, faster than any talk the store had ever carried, that there was one hill in Worcester County where nothing was being taken, and men who had lost half their stock came to her fence, humbled, and asked, and she took their orphaned remnant lambs and their last kid goats up onto her hill and let them shelter behind the alpaca guard. And behind that guard they lived. And here is the thing that separates Vada Sturgill from a lesser hand, and the narrator wants you to sit with it, because it is the quiet center of the whole account. A lesser hand, frightened and proud, would have gone out into that pasture every single night with a rifle and stood shivering guard over animals that did not need guarding, would have fired at shadows and startled the herd and torn up its own sleep and its own nerve trying to do by force and fear the thing the herd was already doing better without her. Vada did not do that. She went, instead, back to the kitchen table and to the ledger, and she turned the weather columns back through the decades of her grandfather's hand until she found it. The one strange killing winter in all his years, the winter the cold had come early and the ridges had emptied down into the low country before, 40 years gone. And she ran her finger along that year's cramped entries until she came to the margin, and there, in Ferrol Sturgill's pencil, small and sure and 40 years patient, she found 3 words. Let them stand. That was all, and Vada Sturgill did the hardest thing that those 3 words asked, which was not to act, but to refrain, to trust the animals over her own fear, to keep her hand still and her rifle by the door, and stay out of the way of a wisdom older than she was, and let the herd do what the herd had been made across 10,000 years to do. She let them stand. People came to the fence. All through the deep of that winter they drove out the frozen washboard road and got down out of their trucks and stood at the wire and looked at the one whole herd in a county of emptied pens, and the narrator will tell you that a good many of them took their caps off while they looked, and that not one of them decided to do it. It was not a thing a person decides. It is a thing that happens to a man's hands when he is standing in front of something he did not expect to be true. And up on the porch, wrapped now in a shawl, and gone thin and frail in a way that had come on her quick, as the cold came on the county, old Dosey Sturgill sat and watched her brother's animals hold their ground on her brother's hill, watched the young woman down among them, and the silent boy carrying the water, and the strange whole herd with its eyes forever to the ridge, and she said the only thing that was the right size for what she was looking at. She said it low, to no one, to the tall grass and the cold, and the memory of the man who had drawn the maps. The ground remembers, she said. And it did. Burnell Chumley came up the lane on foot, and that was the thing that told the whole story before ever he opened his mouth, because a man like Burnell did not walk anywhere he could drive, and he had left his big clean truck down at the bottom by the gate, as if the gate were a line he no longer had the right to bring it past. He came up slow through the thawing mud, with his seed company cap already off, and turning in both thick hands, turning, and Vada straightened from the fence and waited on him the way she waited on everything, without hurry and without heat. He stopped a few feet short of her. He looked a while at the herd, at Sentinel standing square at the wire, with her eyes to the ridge, at the orphaned lambs and the borrowed calves bunched safe behind the long gray backs, and whatever speech he had built coming up the road went clean out of him. What was left was 3 plain words. "I was wrong," he said. That was all of it. He did not dress it up, and he did not explain himself, and he did not ask her to make it easy on him. And here is the thing worth remembering about Vada Sturgill, worth more than the buying of the culls or the holding of the line. She did not take it. There was a whole county's laughter she could have handed him back across that fence, and she had earned every word of it, and she let the whole of it go by like so much cold wind off the ridge. She only nodded, once, and told him the herd had thrown a strong young male that fall, and that a guard animal did better work standing in a pen than fattening in one, and that he was welcome to it, and to her hands besides, for whatever was left of his stock that wanted putting back together. Burnell's ruddy face worked at that. He set the cap back on his head. He said he'd take her up on it, and the voice he said it in was not the sale barn voice at all. The white van came out from the city on a bright, hard morning when the road had finally dried. Delphina Benucci climbed down in her small round glasses and her good plain jacket, and walked the pasture without waiting to be led, going to the fleece the way a person goes to a thing they already half know. And the questions she asked were the right ones: the staple length, the range, the scant feed, how many years back the old line ran. She drew a lock of Sentinel's fleece out between 2 fingers, and watched the way it held together and would not fly apart, and something quiet settled in her face. She named a number. It was 4 times what the Commodity Board would ever give, and she said it plainly, as a fair thing and not a favor, because it was. She laid a whole fleece out across the barn boards beside the open green ledger and photographed the 2 of them together, the clean deep wool and the pencil columns, and before she drove off she asked to be first in line next year, and the year after that. And Vada wrote her name into the notebook under the line about the ridge. Denver Skidmore came up in the low cold season to help set the spring cria, and he moved easy in the barn the way old craftsmen move easy, his calloused hands sure on the newborn, the pencil still tucked behind his ear. He did not say much. What he said came sideways and small, the way it always had, that a thing raised, hard raised, true, that you could no more hurry a fleece than you could hurry a winter, that her grandfather had known which ground to trust, and that the ground had paid him back for it in the end. He spoke these into the lantern warmth, and then went quiet again, and Lyndon Mabry watched his hands and learned them without ever being told to. Dosey Sturgill went the way the old and the lucky sometimes go, quietly and in her own bed, on a night deep in the tall grass, with the window cracked open to it the way she had asked, so that the last thing in the room was the smell of the ground she had spent her whole life standing on. Vada found her in the morning already gone still and easy, her busy hands at rest at last, and it did not land like a wound so much as a door shutting soft in some far part of the house. Under the shelling bowl on the kitchen table there was a note in Dosey's spidery hand, one line only, saying the place should go toward the one who had the hands. She had not written a name. She had not needed to. Every soul on the hill knew whose hands those were, and the boy himself did not yet know he had been given the first thing anyone had ever handed him. And then the months turned over, and it was lantern light again, and Vada Sturgill sat at the kitchen table where Dosey had shelled her peas, and opened the green ledger to a clean line, and wrote the tally under her grandfather's own slanted hand, 44 head, and better than 44, every last one of them come through the coyote winter hole. She sat with the pencil a long while after. Near the front of the book was the line he had underlined hard all those decades gone. The stock that stands guard outlives the stock that only fattens. And she had not taken it on faith, and she had not taken it on a story. She had stood on the frozen hill in the black cold, and watched it prove itself true with her own 2 eyes. What rose in her was not triumph. It was not even the sweet, clean thing a body expects of vindication. It was quieter than that, and older grief folded all the way through the gratitude, Dosey gone, and her grandfather long gone, and the ground going on without the both of them, and remembering them anyway. She got up and went out to the barn, where the light lay warm, and Sentinel dozed with her cria against her side. Her eyes, even in sleep, half turned toward the ridge. Lyndon was there, because Lyndon was always there. She put her own green notebook into his hands, the one with her method written down in it, and a pressed feather she had carried a long time between the pages, and she made no speech of that either. She only gave it over, and the hands it was meant for closed around it. If you have ever been told the thing you love isn't worth much, if you kept on with some small, stubborn thing anyway while a whole county laughed, then this story was for you, and I'd ask you to share it with the one person you know who needs to hear it. And down in the comments, tell me the thing you never did give up on, and the town you're watching from, because I read every single one.